Today I'll be speaking to you about some myths about gifted children that always seem to surface in both education and wider society, and provide some evidence to suggest that these myths are just that, fiction rather than fact. The great George Orwell, literary and political critic, said that myths that are believed in tend to become true. Orwell's thoughts about fiction becoming fact, if we truly believe it, rings true when we apply it to the attitudes we hold towards gifted children. Many of these attitudes are based on both traditional myths and contemporary attitudes that come from these traditions. As there are so many myths surrounding gifted children, I have chosen 3 that are focused mainly on perceptions of the gifted. These are Myth 1, that everyone is gifted; Myth 2, that gifted children have significant social and emotional issues when compared to average children; and Myth 3, that gifted children do not need any extra support or help. Myth 1 emerges from a number of contemporary attitudes about the potential of children, that they all have gifts and talents, and that they are all gifted. They just unwrap their packages at different times. The main reason we believe this myth is that there is some confusion about what is really meant by the term gifted. A collective definition is always hard to ascertain in wider society, unless a certain definition is clarified and promoted. Michael Clay Thompson, teacher and academic in gifted education, made this distinction back in 1998. Gifts are the qualities and strengths of a particular individual. However, giftedness is the word that is used by professionals to describe very bright, intelligent students who require a differentiated curriculum. This distinction is very important to consider so as not to misinterpret the giftedness that we are talking about in this particular educational context. To clarify this further, the Australian education system has adopted Francois Garnier's differentiated model of giftedness and talent as our go-to definition. He defines giftedness as possession and use of outstanding natural abilities, which is essentially an individual's potential, but he clarifies this further by specifying outstanding potential. He adds that this outstanding potential places the child in the top 10% of age peers. This is what giftedness is about. In comparison to other children, a child who has outstanding abilities, which can be developed into outstanding talents, places them in the top 10% of a cohort. And, as Mirica Gross, Professor of Gifted Education at the University of New South Wales suggests, in the average mixed ability classroom, 3 to 4 students could be considered gifted under this definition. In 1999, Mirica Gross published an article about the paradox of gifted education in Australia. Here she rebutted a number of myths about giftedness, using specific examples from the 1988 Australian Government Senate Committee report, and she also examined cultural views of elitism and excellence, as well as equity in Australian schools. She also voiced her concern about wider society believing that everyone is gifted, so she clarified the difference between gifts and strengths. She said that strengths are measured by a comparison to ourselves, matching one performance in one area to another in a different area. However, gifts and talents are measured normatively, which is against the norm or average, that is, comparing our achievements to the achievements of others in the field, rather than just to ourselves. So, using this definition, yes, everyone has strengths, but not gifts. To stop this myth remaining a truth, we should more consistently use the word giftedness only when referring to very bright children in the top 10% of a year group. Garnier's model of giftedness and talent is the one used in all Australian schools and is therefore the accepted definition of giftedness in education in Australia. We can also use the term strengths when referring to something that a child is good at rather than gifts, as parents or the community could misinterpret our use of the words gift to mean gifted. But above all, remember that giftedness is measured normatively in comparison to others. So no, not everyone is gifted. Myth busted. My second myth is that gifted children have higher or more significant social and emotional needs than average children. Unfortunately, Sometimes you might hear the following off-the-cuff comments made about gifted children: that they're intelligent enough to know better, or, in contrast, he or she is so intense, they definitely have issues. These types of comments are mainly due to traditional stereotypes of genius and social expectations and attitudes towards very intelligent people. These stereotypes can be seen everywhere. Just take a look at TV's The Big Bang Theory. Despite the intelligence of the gifted characters presented, their characteristics and personality are ridiculed in each episode. In ancient times, Seneca the Younger wrote that there was never a great genius without a touch of madness, and this type of traditional view is unfortunately still around today. How many times have you heard that there's a fine line between genius and insanity? In 1891, Cesare Lambrosco, an Italian physician and criminologist, completed a study on male artistic genius. He discovered a correlation between high intelligence and insanity, or at least emotional instability. However, 100 years later, researchers have indicated some interesting insights into normative measures of intelligence and well-being. In 1999, Maureen Neihart, an American clinical child psychologist, summarised what the empirical literature had to say about gifted children and their psychological well-being. An individual's well-being can be defined by the way they positively cope or negatively fail to respond to the demands of their environment. The research she reviewed indicated that gifted children and non-gifted children are comparable when it comes to self-concept, an idea or perception of oneself. They are also comparable when it comes to depression and suicide rates. Behavioural issues may occur in younger gifted children if they are not catered for. However, the same could be said for the average child or the learning support child. Very little research has been completed on psychiatric disorders in gifted children, and only a few have been done on gifted adults, so this area needs some further research. To go into some of the findings in more detail, I want to draw your attention to two studies that focus on gifted teenagers due to our own high school context. Joe Nail and Gary Evans investigated the emotional adjustment of teens with non-gifted teens. The US study was small, with Year 9 to 12 gifted students outnumbering the non-gifted. The reason why this study was important was because the findings contradicted those of previous studies. They found that gifted students showed better emotional adjustment than non-gifted students, and that the emotional adjustments of gifted teens to non-gifted teens fell within average limits when compared normatively. Some of the limitations of this particular study was that there were less girls in the non-gifted group, which affects the gender distribution, especially when it comes to anxiety, which I will look at shortly. Neihart also suggested gifted students used in this particular study were volunteers, whereas the non-gifted students were randomly selected from English classes, which may also affect the findings. Nail and Evans suggested gifted students have different individual social and emotional needs, and this must be considered when dealing with each individual child. Research into the emotional well-being of gifted teens is ongoing. I mentioned anxiety previously, and I want to go into this further. In 1996, Tong and Yuchuk studied 78 Canadian Year 10 to 12 students and found that although the levels of self-concept in both gifted and non-gifted students was similar, there were some gender differences. Gifted students, especially gifted girls, had higher levels of anxiety than those in the regular program, and gifted boys had more behavioural problems. As the regular program was not one that would have necessarily challenged the gifted students, perhaps the challenge of a gifted program was what was creating the anxiety in all gifted students, and possibly the misbehaviour in the male gifted students as well. Tong and Yuchuk were also concerned with the fact that the girls seemed to have a less positive self-concept than the boys, which would seem to match up with the increased anxiety towards their studies. Further study about anxiety in gifted students is needed to help pinpoint the ways we can help students cope with their academic anxiety. The myth that gifted students have higher social and emotional needs than non-gifted students has emerged from tradition, and we really need to understand contemporary research and reflect it in our teaching and our conversations with parents and the wider community. Much of the research indicates that comparatively, there is little difference in social and emotional issues of gifted and non-gifted children. Neihart tells us that the psychological well-being of a gifted child is related to their types of giftedness, their educational fit, and the child's personal characteristics. So essentially, we cannot tar all gifted children with the same brush. They are not a homogenous group. Gifted children do have social and emotional needs, the same way as everyone does. Research into the area needs to continue for this myth to be totally busted. But for the time being, we must deal with the social and emotional problems of gifted students on a specific and individualised level, keeping an open mind when it comes to traditional myths and possible misconceptions. The final myth we are considering today is also related to the social and emotional needs of gifted children, and it is that gifted children do not need support. This myth stems from views like, if they're gifted, they can figure it out on their own. We should really help students who need it. Or, they're smarter than me, there's no way that I can help them. So, as an English teacher, how on earth can I help support someone like Doogie Howser? Again, tradition and TV is to blame for all of the same reasons identified earlier. Many academics in gifted education have credited our societal views about gifted children to the conflict that exists between excellence and equity. Those who are intelligent and therefore excellent end up being ignored when it comes to extra assistance, as they are the ones who society believes does not need the support because of their excellence. This is the paradox that Miracle Gross explored in the article mentioned earlier. To clarify this paradox, which is the crux of this myth, I'll give you an example. In 2001, the US Congress passed legislation called the No Child Left Behind Act, where standards-based education was imposed across the US, and a focus was placed on disadvantaged students. As a result, there was no funding for 5 years for gifted programs. Bringing the top down does not necessarily mean bringing the bottom up, which was an idea explored by Joyce Van Tassel-Basker in her article called Excellence as a Standard for All Education, which was printed in a gifted journal by a gifted academic, but highlighted the importance of educational excellence for all students. In 2015, the name of the act was changed to Every Child Succeeds, indicating that they wanted more equitable and challenging education for all students. Equity and challenge is needed to enable gifted children to be able to transform their gifts into talents. Going back to Gagne's model, which defines giftedness as potential rather than actual performance, the process of transforming gifts into talents is affected by a series of catalysts, both interpersonal and intrapersonal, as well as chance. Many gifted children suffer from what Sylvia Rim calls underachievement syndrome, where varying interpersonal and intrapersonal catalysts have a negative effect on the achievement of the child. Rim's research indicated that the characteristics of low self-esteem, which can be affected by teacher, parental, and self-expectations, as well as low personal control that the child believes they have of their own life, can affect a gifted child. So much so that they can become rebellious or put up other defence mechanisms to hide their low self-belief. These types of students do need extra support, as they cannot turn their gifts into talents without assistance. Susan Weinbrenner, who has written a number of books about differentiating for gifted students in the mixed ability classroom, has a helpful table to help with the identification of achieving and underachieving students, not just gifted students. Quadrant 1 contains the students who are high achievers, whether gifted or not, which we all want our students to be. They perceive that when they work hard, they get good results. Quadrant 2 is one where we may find many of our gifted students, the ones who get high grades without the hard work or effort needed. They don't like challenging work, and if they find they have to work hard, they believe that others might think that they are not so smart. Quadrant 3 students are the ones who work hard but don't achieve because they are not using strategies we teach that are needed for their success. Quadrant 4 is where we find the underachievers, those who are not working anymore because for them it's not worth it. As Weinbrenner suggests, as educators, we need to prevent all students, whether gifted or not, from moving into this last quadrant. We should aim to engage, motivate and support all students to be in Quadrant 1. Much of this has to do with convincing the students that the work that we are doing with them in class is valuable and can actually be used outside of the classroom. In 2003, a US study of 178 gifted, achieving and underachieving high school students from year 9 through to 12 was completed to see if students valued the work they were given. McCoach and Siegel found that both achievers and underachievers had positive self-concepts, but goal valuation and motivation were distinguishing factors between the two groups. So there was a strong relationship between students' goals and how motivated they were to achieve them. Our role as teachers is to engage and motivate students to reach their goals, and if they don't have any clear goals, maybe we should help them set some. In 2012, these two researchers were also a part of another study, albeit small, that specifically focused on an intervention program for students. In the 9-week period, despite the everyday interruptions that exist in a school environment, the academic grades for students in the program increased. This is because the teachers in this program focused on future goals and relevance to the world outside the classroom, as well as making content and skill connections to their individual student interests. In 2006, a New Zealand study of 41 students moving into middle school made similar findings about self-concept to McCoach and Siegel's earlier study. Out of the 41 students, 24 were identified as achieving and the rest were underachieving students. The academic self-concept for underachievers was a little lower than those of achievers, but not substantial. But the key finding was that the underachievers had a lower expectation of future achievements, which reinforced the previous study that indicated that interventions used to help students engage with real-world content and motivate them to create goals to support their achievement would help gifted underachievers. Obviously, helping to motivate gifted students, especially those who are not achieving, is crucial to helping them through the development process of turning their gifts into talents. We need to help students see that there is relevance in both the skills and structures we teach them in the classroom, and that they can be applied to the outside world. We must be aware of our beliefs and our expectations of gifted students, as they can internalise teacher and parent expectations in the form of stress. Gifted children, like average children and learning support children, do need our help. Our expectations and attitudes do affect their talent development, and we must continue to motivate, challenge, and engage them in the classroom. Myth busted. Orwell's quote about myths becoming truths, if they are believed in, is a clear reflection of our media-influenced, stereotype-accepting contemporary society. It is only once we see these myths put to the test with evidence to prove or even suggest otherwise that we will stop believing these myths and seeing the truth as it stands before us, seeing gifted children as they really are, intelligent individuals who need our support to be the very best they can be in order to contribute to our future. In closing, I want you to consider another quote, also by a writer, Paul Collins to be exact, and I want you to replace autists with gifted children. Gifted children are the ultimate square pegs, and the problem with pounding a square peg into a round hole is not that the hammering is hard work, it's that you're destroying the peg. A teacher's role in gifted education is not to hammer the gifted into an area where they do not fit, as defined by society's myths, beliefs, or expectations, but to recognise gifted children, not destroy them. Recognise that they are unique in themselves by putting the hammer away and finding other ways to support, motivate, and challenge them through their schooling, rather than working hard to define them as something they are not. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me today.